If you have your Bibles, you can go with me to Daniel chapter 2. In our Daniel series together, we're going to go chapter by chapter, Lord willing, through the book of Daniel. And a curiosity question as we open our time together. Have any of you suffered from sleeplessness? Anybody suffered from, My dad one time a few years ago, we were talking about this, and he goes, getting old is not for the weak at heart. It's like, this is, he talked about his regular sleeplessness, and I was like, oh, awesome, I haven't slept particularly well in the last couple weeks, and it's, it's one of those things for me, it's like, your body's tired, you try to go to sleep, and your brain's like, bing, it's like, your brain's on, and it's like going a mile a minute, and it's like, oh, stop, I'm just trying to sleep right now. So I haven't slept particularly well here recently, and there's lots of reasons you can lose sleep. There are maybe some of you here today that you're like, I have an infant, right? You're like, you'll sleep in a couple years, okay? It's all right, you'll sleep in a couple years, that's okay. There's other reasons though, sometimes, we can have worry or stress. Sometimes we can have caffeine or chocolate too late in the day. Sometimes we don't get enough exercise. There's lots of reasons why sleeplessness occurs. One of the interesting things about Daniel 2 is we meet a king who is suffering from sleeplessness. And God uses that, God works that in his life in grace to reveal truth to him, okay? And so God's going to weave in the middle of hard things, difficult things, or even bad things in life for his glory, to accomplish his good purposes. And he's going to do that in our life as well. I want to read the text of Daniel chapter 2. It is a longer text than often we read on a Sunday morning, but I think you'll find it's a very engaging story. And so we're going to read it and then look through it together. Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse number 1. It says, now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the commandment to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I've had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we'll give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason, the king was very angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. And then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand." Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation." Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, "I have found a man of the captains of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation." The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" And Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anything living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation of the dream, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now this is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, then another and a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, "Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. It's quite a storyline. I want to walk through some details of it and give some key points for us today to walk out of here with. The text starts with Nebuchadnezzar. We kind of meet the king himself, who just generically took over in chapter 1 of Daniel. Here, Daniel introduces us to King Nebuchadnezzar early in his reign. He is expanding rapidly as a young man who's running Babylon. And he is, in a sense, we would call kind of at the top of the food chain. He is this great king. He's not only conquered Israel and Judah, but he's conquered much of the known world at the time. He is a world superpower, okay, in this time period. And what we hear next is not what we would expect to hear. I mean, we would expect he's loving life, he's sleeping well, he's having lots of fun with all his wealth and riches. But it's not what we hear. You know, it's the same thing we kind of expect for the rich and famous of our day. I mean, life must be good when you have that much money, we think, right? As we think about celebrities or the rich and powerful. That much money, that much power, that many women, adoring you, that must be nice, we think to ourselves sometimes. And what we reveal in those thoughts is what makes up the good life, right? What does make up the good life? We're seeing Nebuchadnezzar, we're like, man, he should be enjoying the good life, and he is not so. We're surprised sometimes when we hear the divorce rate among the rich and famous, when we see how angry and rude they act with common folk. It's surprising to us, and it's surprising in Daniel 2 perhaps, that this great king at the top of his game is not sleeping. He's suffering from this insomnia. He has fear raging in him, and he is deeply troubled and grows increasingly angry in the text. We almost even sympathize with him slightly. We're like, man, I almost feel bad for King Nebuchadnezzar here. He gathers what seems to be his senior wise men, and he tells them in the text here, I've been having a bad dream, right? And they respond like, hey, sure, tell us the dream, and we'll give you the interpretation. And, it's what's interesting here in verse 4 is they respond in Aramaic. Just a quick side note here, from this point of the book of Daniel until the end of chapter 7, the text turns to Aramaic. It's one of the few. It's very rare. Ezra is the only other book in very small sections of Ezra that uses Aramaic. Daniel starts in Hebrew, which is mostly Old Testament, and then Aramaic here from 2:4 through the end of chapter 7, okay? And then it bounces back to Hebrew to finish out. So the little key point here in verse 4, they spoke in Aramaic, and in some sense it has to do with this is the common language in Babylon and much of the world at that time. And what we see is the beginning of this major action on the world stage of what God is doing, okay? There's also in chapter 7, there's a repeated vision there in chapter 7 that parallels this one in chapter 2 that kind of starts the section and ends the section, okay? We'll talk more about that as we get to chapter 7. But what's interesting here is as they talk to the king responds, no. Let me be clear, right? He says, I want the dream and its interpretation. And if you don't, I'm going to cut you up into little pieces and burn your houses to the ground for motivation, right? But if you do well, I will reward you richly. And it's almost like you can almost hear this kind of pause and this awkward laughter, like he's joking, right? Because they repeat the same phrase. They're like, okay, you give us the dream, we'll give the interpretation. He's like, they already said that, and the king's like, no, let's be clear. And then they're like, you can't be serious. You got to give us the dream and give the interpretation. I was thinking about this week, I don't know if you've done this before. If you ever go to a psychiatrist, I mean, you got to do this, okay? Hey, doc, I've been having a I've been having a really weird dream. And it's like, these guys eat this stuff up. They're like, oh, dreams, cool. And they're like, well, slow down. Tell me the whole thing. And you're like, no. No, I want you to tell me the dream and its interpretation. And they're like, what? That's not how it works, right? It's not how it works. You got to tell me the dream, and I love doing this stuff, and I'll give you all this means that, and give you the interpretation. So if I ever go to a psychiatrist, I'm trying this trick, okay? But this is what the king does here. No, I want the dream, and you give me the interpretation of it. And he's very clear here. He grows impatient in the text here. My decision is firm. He stresses it. And he accuses the wise men of stalling. And in verse 10 and 11, here's a key point to the text, okay? In narrative texts like this one, oftentimes some of the dialogue becomes very significant. Let me give you an illustration of that. Think to the Joseph story in the really kind of the second half of the book of Genesis. In the narrative text of Joseph, you remember very near the end of it, in Genesis 50, dad dies and the brothers are now really scared that Joseph is now going to turn on him. Like maybe he's been nice to us because dad's still around, but now that dad's dead, like this could go really bad. So they're like really begging Joseph, be nice. And he's like, what's going on here? And what he says to them, he says, you meant it for evil, selling me into slavery and such. He said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That's not just a little statement there in their little narrative. That's a big explanation phrase for much of Genesis, and it tells you about God. It's a huge statement in that very small interaction between he and his brothers. It tells you about the whole Joseph story. Here in Daniel 2, we learn a lot in verse 10 and 11 by these pagan wise men who say, this is impossible, what you're asking of us. And what they tell the king is, they say, fearful for their lives in front of this irrational king, they say not only is it impossible, but they say only the gods can do what you're asking. Only the gods can reveal these secret dreams that you're referring to. And what they say next is, and they aren't available whenever we want them. The gods don't answer to us. They're capricious and they're unpredictable that we worship. But you're asking us to right now give you the secret dream and its interpretation. The gods are the only ones that can do this, and they are not those who dwell among flesh. They're not available to us. Is this what the king wants to hear? Absolutely not, right? So angry, very furious, the text says he's just like, kill them all. They start slaughtering the wise men. And it's here where we're getting this glimpse of this pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar. And part of us, we're listening to this a little bit sympathetic to Daniel, a little bit sympathetic because if you follow the storyline of Israel and you're like, man, this horrible pagan nation is conquering them and everything else. And you're almost kind of like, I guess we could just step back and let them kill each other. I mean, I don't know. Like, you're almost not too whatever you guys can do. And then we realize that there's a bigger conflict than just what's going on here, because what do we learn at the end of that first section, verse 12? And we learn that what's going on, they're also going to do what? They're going to search after Daniel and his friends because, they've been promoted in chapter 1 to be wise men. And you're like, which seemed like a great thing in chapter 1, right? And then all of a sudden in chapter 2, it's like out of the frying pan and into the fire. We're like, oh no, they're going to kill Daniel now because the conflict is brewing, taking very sharp focus here at the beginning of this amazing plot line. In verse number 14, Arioch, who's the captain of the guard, he's the main guy who's going around and killing the wise men, he comes to Daniel. Daniel, it says, behaves with wisdom in this passage and discretion. And he replies calmly to Arioch, hey, what's the rush? What's this? What's going on here? Why is this so urgent? And he receives an explanation. So clearly he wasn't there. So it seems like just the senior wise men were present with the king of Babylon. And it's this, he's kind of gives a surprising response here, right? Because I would expect if I'm like, I get rumors that like, hey, all the wise men are dead, like you're all gonna die. I wouldn't like want to be found. And then even more surprising is what Daniel does next. Who does he go to? He goes in front of this angry, impetuous king. He goes straight to the source. And he asks for a little bit of time to give the king the interpretation. So instead of panicking, he goes to the very source of who's killing all the wise men. It's pretty amazing. And what Daniel does next is also surprising. The very thing that most professing Christians avoid, the one meeting they avoid is prayer meeting. What does Daniel do? Daniel gathers folks and says, we're having a prayer meeting right here, right now. We're going to seek the Lord. And that's what they do. They want to seek the mercy from the God of heaven. He knew where to go, God, and he knew how to get there, right? Through prayer. And it's a powerful passage because it provides the kind of climax. All this conflict, and the climax is God, the God of wisdom who knows all these things, he actually is accessible, right? He is one who will dwell among flesh, like verses 10 and 11 told us about. And so the God of heaven reveals in his wisdom, he reveals it to mankind. And what we see next is Daniel thanking God and then going before the king, right? It's one of those things from the very beginning. He makes it clear God of heaven has done this, right? And it's interesting because Arioch, do you notice what Arioch does in verse number 25? Arioch, the captain of the guard, like, all of us tend to do this, but we all want a little piece of the glory pie. Like, Arioch is like, King, I found you a guy who's going to give you, the interpretation. I found him, just make sure you know that. Okay, Daniel, go ahead and go ahead. It's like we all want a little piece of the glory pie, and Daniel walks in and is specifically asked, are you able to do this? And he's like, no. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. And he's made it known to the king. And so he deflects the praise. It's not me, it's God alone who does this stuff. And he gives the dream and its interpretation. The dream is that there's a giant statue. It's got a head of gold. It's got chest and arms of silver, belly and thigh of bronze, and its legs are of iron. Its feet are mixed iron and clay. And then all of a sudden in the dream, there's this stone that it specifically says not cut with human hands, and it's hurled through the air, hits the statue, and it doesn't just hit the statue in the feet and the statue falls over. What happens? The statue is pulverized. It's like chaff, the text says. It's like wheat chaff in the Old Testament. You throw up in the air and the chaff just blows off. It doesn't just blow off. It's never even seen again. It disappears. It's pulverized completely. Verse 35, blown into the air with no trace of it being found, right? Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time in the interpretation today. There's a parallel vision, as I said, in chapter 7 that gets more specific. And so we'll get more specific in the text in chapter 7. But we come to prophecy, and Daniel has a lot of it. And our first thing is like, who, when, where? Tell me all about it. I want the details, right? We're all like, oh yeah, let's go. Prophecy is cool, And what Daniel does, he doesn't even get into all of it. He doesn't describe who the chest and arms of silver, the bronze. He doesn't get into all who these kingdoms are. Chapter 7 does more of that. But what he does say is, hey, king, you are the head of gold. You are this great king that God has set up here. God has given you this place, okay? He's the one who has set you there. And then the emphasis really next is on a stone. It's very distinguished. There's this stone not cut with human hands, and it's troubling to Nebuchadnezzar. That stone comes and it destroys it, and then it grows into a mountain that is over the entire earth. Okay, so he does mention there's 4 kingdoms, okay, and they're transient in nature. They don't hold everlasting power, but this stone that comes is going to destroy them, and its power, its reign, its kingdom is going to be everlasting. There is one true God that rules and reigns, is what the vision is really driving Nebuchadnezzar at. You are one of those kingdoms, and God sets you up in a great place, and you have power But that power will not last. It's transient. There's going to be other kingdoms that arise after you, and they will all submit to one great stone that's going to come that'll turn into a mountain, and it will last forever. Well, you saw the end of the passage. Nebuchadnezzar is overwhelmed. It wouldn't be common for one of the greatest kings in history to fall on his face, literally prostrate before Daniel and bow before him. But that's what King Nebuchadnezzar does. He says, your God is the great God of heaven, right? Your God is the God of gods and Lord of kings. That's what Daniel receives. There's praise, there's rich reward for Daniel, and his three friends are also added on to that at the very end. I want to look at just a couple lessons from this passage this morning. The first is this. We're meant to, in this passage, behold the greatness of God's wisdom. We're meant to see in this passage a dramatic contrast between worldly wisdom and the wisdom that God alone possesses. We're to behold the greatness of God's wisdom. The greatest king, one of the greatest kings in world history, couldn't buy the wisdom that God alone possesses. Out of all his astrologers and soothsayers and wise men, he had, like Daniel, some stolen the best and the brightest from various nations around the world. They couldn't figure it out, right? They couldn't get it. The source of ultimate wisdom is God himself. And God alone can graciously reveal that wisdom as he does here. And it's surprising when he does do that. It's amazing because there's this contrast. Nebuchadnezzar is one who is named after the Babylonian god of wisdom, Nabu. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar is named after the god of wisdom, the Babylonian god of wisdom. So you're like, man, he's kind of tight with this God. He can't figure out his own dreams. He can't buy enough wisdom to figure out the dreams. So he grows impetuous, sleepless, angry, right? And in the text, who is calm, who is going to the source of wisdom, and who receives wisdom from God? It's Daniel, right? There's a contrast, dramatic contrast in the passage. This young man who doesn't panic, he doesn't fall hopeless, he goes to the source of wisdom, and when he receives wisdom, this was hard too. Sometimes when we receive truth and wisdom, like we have a hard time telling it. We're like, hey, king, you're a great king, you're the head of gold, but there's one that's greater and mightier than you. And you better submit to him or you will be pulverized. It's sometimes hard to know truth and then do what? Speak truth to power. That's hard. Here's what Daniel does in wisdom here. The wisdom of God is on display, sovereign over all the generations and world kingdoms, but also one who works and speaks to even a pagan king here in this text. God is revealing, I put you there. It's my mercy who's done this. And there's one God who controls the future, not you. It's me. This points us to this stone that will crush and pulverize. We read in Psalm 118 today about the chief cornerstone. And at the end of Psalm 118, it talks about that. Jesus picks up the language in Luke 20. In Luke 20, Jesus tells a story about a selfish generation. A generation that's like, I want, the master's vineyard, and I'm going to kill whoever gets in my way, and he's going to send the son, I'm going to kill the son, and then that vineyard's going to be mine. And Jesus speaks in verse 17 and 18 of Luke 20. He says, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. It's a quote from Psalm 118. And then he starts to use some Daniel language at the end there. He says, whoever falls on that stone will be broken. But whoever the stone falls on, it will grind him to powder. Does that sound Daniel-like here in this passage? The stone that will crush all who are crushed by it, who do not submit, but who selfishly try to take their kingdom. The kingdom of God will come, and Jesus pointing out in Luke 20, I am the stone that the builders rejected. I am the stone, like Daniel, that will be sent. So this all points us all the way to King Jesus. I mean, think about the Israelites in the 5th century following the book of Daniel, reading this text, okay? The 4th century BC, where they realize that they and their ancestors have so grievously and repeatedly offended God that God gave them into exile, right? That's what we're seeing here in Daniel. Daniel's taken in chapter 1 in exile. And there's generations after this, even though some get sent back to Jerusalem, they come back and the temple's been destroyed, and they kind of just carry on under different world powers for many generations. Never really coming out fully out of exile. And they realize, hey, our sin has put us there. They realize, kind of like the sun is hot, and there's some blessing to that for us, but if we get too close to the sun, what happens? We will be consumed by it. You know, when you think about the holiness of God, his presence, I mean, the people of Israel were the nation that was known by the presence of God. Literally, he dwelt among them. They had built the temple in the middle of Jerusalem. God dwells with us, is what that was saying. And yet they had taken his presence lightly, and they had rebelled against his rule and lived life their own way. And eventually God said, if you want it your own way, I'm going to give you over into exile. They're experiencing that reading the book of Daniel. And yet what do they see in this? They see exactly what they've done, but they also see God has not abandoned us. He's not abandoned us. He's preserved a remnant. He's preserving a remnant in Daniel and his friends through the storylines of what's going on here. He's not forgotten his people. In fact, the all-wise God is speaking about that one day he's going to set up his king in his kingdom that will reign forever. God in his all-wise sovereignty is going to do this. And he's saying it through and to one of the great kings, the first great king that took him over, the king Nebuchadnezzar. God has not forgotten his people. And at the right time of history, he's going to do what? He's going to intercede, and he's going to send his son. He's going to make a way once again for his people to dwell with him. How is the all-wise God going to do that? Not by the blood of bulls and goats anymore. He's going to do it through his spotless son as the sacrificial substitute. Colossians 2 speaks about Christ. In him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. That is the Son, Jesus Christ. In the all-wise plan of God, Jesus took our place. He who knew no sin became sin for you. Why? How? To do what? So that we might become the righteousness of God in him. 2 Corinthians 5:21. The call in Daniel is not just to say, hey, you be more like Daniel. Try harder, do better. The thing is, we need a Savior. We need the all-wise plan of God to not look to us to do better, but to send one so that we could once again dwell with God is what we're meant, our hearts long for. And the all-wise plan of God, the greatness of his wisdom that's on display here, it leads us all the way to Jesus. Through world powers and everything else, it leads us all the way to this stone that comes and sets up an eternal kingdom. That's the glory of beholding the greatness of God's wisdom. I want to secondly highlight here that this great wisdom, this God of wisdom, is available. There's access to God that's available. And I want to make two statements with that. First, we see it's available through the path of prayer. Through the path of prayer. There's this amazing statement as we've highlighted in verses 10 and 11, right? That this is impossible what you're asking of us, King, the wise men say. And they say what? Only the gods can do this, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Well, throughout the passage, another thing that's key in narratives is you look for what's repeated. Repeated through this passage, it puts on display that there is an all-wise God, that there is a God of heaven, is the phrase used all over the place. Verse number 18. Daniel and his friends seek mercies from the God of heaven. Verse 19, the end there, so Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Verse number 28, Daniel, before King Nebuchadnezzar, there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. As he's telling the interpretation, verse 37, O king, you, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you your kingdom. Verse number 44, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. So over and over again, the God of heaven, and that kind of goes to, the gods are out there, and they're sovereign, well, great and all, but do they dwell among us? Are they really available? Like 10 and 11 say here. Daniel knows it and shows us that there is access to this transcendent, all-wise God. And how is that? It's through prayer. It's the very place that Daniel turns and where we can too. It's stressed in this passage how urgent the need is. Literally, life and death hang in the balance, right? You're going to die if you can't give the dream and its interpretation. Life hanging in the balance. Well, what does Daniel do? Where does he turn? You know, there are moments where we feel powerless, where we feel like there's no hope. And where do we turn, right? We're tempted in those moments to get out of there, right? We're tempted to just get out. And it's like, I got to take care of myself. I mean, I don't know how many among us, I would guess pretty high percentage, if we knew if we were wise men, and that was a stretch for some of us, okay? But if we were all wise men, and it's like the king's like, hey, kill them all, we wouldn't be like, hey, king, I'm over here, right? We'd be like, I'm running and hiding somewhere. That's what we would get out of there, right? That's what we tend to do, take care of myself. I'm not gonna go before the king and then pray with watching eyes on me to give its interpretation. I'm taking care of myself, getting out of there. We're also tempted to just give up. I mean, why even try? You like we said, out of the frying pan into the fire, like, oh man, well, God helped me once here, but like, it seemed hopeless in chapter 1, but now it's like, oof, what are we gonna do now? I mean, how many times, we sometimes think to ourselves, how many times have I failed God? Why in the world would God listen to me? We get hopeless. We stop praying. Well, why would he listen to me? I'm so small and so insignificant. We give up. We're overwhelmed because it's too big or too urgent. I mean, I'll confess to you, I've been living here for over 17 years, but 17 and a half years. I've been in the March for Life a long time, many, many times, the March for Life. And I'm just telling you that I've prayed for the March for Life. I've prayed for God to do a work, but I, deep down, it's like, I promise you, I never thought it would be in my lifetime. Never. It's too big. It's too much. There's no way. I was overwhelmed Friday. Do some of you, like me, something's too big or it's just too urgent or something. I can't go in prayer to this. This is too much. I can't. God, you can't do that or won't do that. Not for me, at least. We stop praying. We think it's too much. And I've just been reminded, God answers prayer. It's what God does. In his good time, God answers prayer. What Daniel does is he doesn't, get out of there. He doesn't give up. He gets down on his knees. And he humbly prays. He gathers, the text says. Sometimes we just think about prayer private and just personal. Just me and God, which is good. But Daniel gathers his best friends. It is like, you guys, let's seek God together. There's a prayer meeting. It's more in a public setting, we would say. They humbly seek the God of heaven for mercy. And God responds. I mean, we know the verses like this. James 4:6 and 1 Peter 5:5, they both say, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That's what God does. He delights to do it. James 4:8, draw near to God, and he'll do what? He'll draw near to you, right? That's what God promises. And yet we struggle to go down the path of prayer, to really believe that God is accessible to us. Humble prayer is where God is present. Secondly, not only through the path of prayer, but through the gate of praise. We read these verses, Psalm 118 today, we opened with. It says in verse 19, "Open to me the gates of righteousness. I will go through them and I will praise the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord through which the righteous shall enter." Through the gate of praise. Daniel chapter 2, verse 20 through 22. "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever. For wisdom and might are his." And it's just this glory, praise to God. Psalm 22:3, "God inhabits the praises of his people." You want to know where God is present? He's present in praise. So through the gate of praise is where God is accessible. And coupled with praise, this similar parallel thought is in verse 23, "I thank you and praise you." In Luke 17, Jesus healed 10 lepers. Remember the story? 10 lepers, and he healed them in an interesting way. He says, go present yourselves to the priest. And so they're like, okay, whatever. They start going to the priest, and on the way, they're healed. And they're like, yes, this is awesome, I'm healed. How many return to thank Jesus? Just one. Just one, right? The call in the text, you want to know where we have accessibility to God? Through praise and thanksgiving. Notice the example in the text. Praise is not just a few words and then we kind of give to God and then we're like, I take all the credit myself. I get a piece of the pie for me. Like Arioch did as he tries to take the credit. Daniel, throughout this passage, constantly is deflecting the praise. This is not possible through me. The God of heaven has made this known. He says it repeatedly and focuses all the attention on God. And it's amazing because at the end of this passage, who also is praising the God of gods and the Lord of kings? The pagan king himself. Now we're going to find in the weeks to come, this is the beginning of God opening the blind eyes of Nebuchadnezzar. It's pretty exciting. But he's not there yet. He exalts the king, he exalts the God of Daniel, but we'll see in the next chapter, Lord willing, next week, he's going to do what? He's going to build a big idol to himself. So he's not there yet, but his eyes begin to open. God's using his wisdom to put on display before a pagan king, and he begins to realize who he is before this God. God's at work in the heart. God is accessible through prayer and through praise. This is what God delights to do. Let me give you a couple kind of concrete applications. Sometimes when it comes to prayer and praise, we're kind of like, oh yeah, I should pray more. Can I give you two things to think about this week? Let me encourage you, number one, to genuinely get alone with God this week. And there's not a hard and fast rule to this, but I'm going to give you a number, okay? I would challenge you to spend a half an hour with you and God alone this week. For some of you, that is like unthinkable, right? You're like, what? What am I going to talk about for a half an hour in prayer? I just encourage you, just you and God in a focused time this week. Be alone with him. We've taught here before. I'll give you a little cheat code, right? Pray, P-R-A-Y, praise. Spend time just talking about who he is, exalting in him. Pray. Repent. There's things that we have to say, hey, I'm not right with you. There's thirdly, ask. There's plenty of things that are on your heart to pour out before God. And the fourth, P-R-A-Y, is to yield to God. Say, God, use me for your name's sake today. My eyes, my ears, my lips, my tongue, my hands, my feet, let them be used for you this very day. And then let me challenge you, secondly, that's first, is you spending time with God, focused time. Let me say secondly, kind of another challenge for you this week is this. I want to challenge you to shorten the time between your thoughts about God. Okay, so one is just spending specific time with God. Secondly is to shorten your time between thoughts about God. Bring God consciously into the daily moments of life. 1 Thessalonians 5:17 says, we're to pray without ceasing. He's not saying every one of you, why are you here? Like you should be praying somewhere. He's not saying that, right? He's saying you should constantly have God in the everyday moments of your life. So one is we need to focus in and spend quality time with God, specific time with God. But secondly, we need to then shorten the spectrum of how long between thoughts about God we have. And so bringing God into the everyday moments of your life. I don't think Daniel would have done well if he wasn't walking with God, hit off guard, into reactionary mode about like, oh, someone's going to kill me. Well, what am I going to do now? I'm not like, I don't know that he was praying at that moment. So bring God into everyday moments of your life. Those two challenges for you this week. Daniel chapter 2, this passage puts on display the wisdom of God. The world stage level of like grand moments of world power shifting on their way to King Jesus setting up his eternal kingdom. Personal conflict level of Daniel's life at stake. And it teaches us that the God of heaven, who is all wise, who rules and reigns in the heavens, he is accessible. You and I have access to this God of all wisdom through the path of prayer and the gate of praise. Let's live for his kingdom. Through all the sleeplessness that we face, through all the fear that the world throws at us, let's live for his kingdom. The all-wise God is at work. Would you run to him? Would you draw near and he'll do what? He'll draw near to you. Let's pray together. Our Father, thank you for a passage like this, an amazing story, but one that's supposed to remind us of who you are, God, and what you're doing in and through us and calling us to yourself. Oh, Lord, would you this week, would you make it something that we just don't say, oh, I know that Sunday school story, but God, that you would cause us to be those who run to your presence, who lean into your wisdom, who don't just live life in our own strength and wisdom and power, but who rely upon you. God, thank you for your grace. Teach us and grow us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.